On August 1, 1969, three newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received an identical letter through the mail. Inside each envelope was a message, handwritten in block capital letters, along with a piece of cardstock, cut into three separate sections, each containing a portion of an intricate cipher composed of unfamiliar symbols. The letters demanded that the newspapers print the cipher on their front pages. If they refused, the writer promised he would go out that weekend and kill again. The letters were signed with a circle bisected by a cross, a symbol that resembled a crosshair, and they claimed responsibility for three recent, unsolved attacks in the region. The author would soon give himself a name, one he would use in every subsequent communication over the following years, a name that would come to define one of the most extensive and to this day still unresolved criminal investigations in American history: Zodiac. Over the course of the next several years, this individual would claim responsibility for at least 7 attacks across Northern California, 5 of which resulted in confirmed deaths, though he himself would eventually claim, in one of his many letters, to have killed as many as 37 people, a figure investigators have never been able to substantiate, but that added yet another layer of terror and uncertainty to a case already defined by how little was actually known about the person responsible for it. He taunted police through a series of increasingly elaborate letters sent to Bay Area newspapers over the following years. He included ciphers that he claimed, if solved, would reveal his identity. He threatened to attack a school bus full of children. He sent, along with one letter, a bloodied swatch of fabric torn from a victim's shirt as proof of his claims. And then, after 1974, the letters stopped. He was never identified. He was never arrested. He was never brought to trial. Despite one of the largest and most sustained homicide investigations in California law enforcement history, involving multiple police departments, the FBI, and decades of amateur and professional investigation that continues into the present day, the Zodiac Killer remains officially unsolved. To understand why this case has resisted resolution for over 5 decades, and to understand what is actually known, as opposed to speculated, about the man responsible for these crimes, we have to walk through the attacks themselves in the order they occurred, examine the communications that followed each one, and confront directly the enormous body of theory, speculation, and disputed evidence that has accumulated around this case in the years since. The first attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on the night of December 20th, 1968, on Lake Herman Road, a secluded area outside Vallejo, California, frequently used by local teenagers as a parking spot. David Faraday, 17 years old, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16 years old, were on their first date together, parked in Faraday's mother's car along the isolated road, when a second vehicle pulled up behind them sometime around 11 at night. What happened next has been reconstructed largely through physical evidence, since neither victim survived to describe it. Betty Lou Jensen appeared to have gotten out of the car, possibly in an attempt to run, and was shot multiple times in the back as she fled roughly 28 feet from the vehicle. David Faraday was shot once, at close range, while still in or near the car. Both were found by a passerby shortly after the attack. Faraday died en route to the hospital. Jensen was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no immediate claim of responsibility. No letter followed this attack, at least not one that arrived before the next incident occurred. Investigators treated it, in the months that followed, as a tragic and unsolved double homicide, one of an unfortunately significant number of unsolved violent crimes in the region during this period, without any indication that it was the opening act of a much longer and more elaborate campaign. 6 months later, on the night of July 4th, 1969, the pattern repeated with a critical difference. Darlene Ferrin, 22 years old, and Michael Mageau, 19, were parked in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park, also near Vallejo, at approximately midnight, when a second car pulled into the parking area behind them, its headlights illuminating their vehicle. The car sat behind them for several minutes before its driver got out, approached on foot with a flashlight, and, without any verbal exchange that either victim later reported, opened fire directly into the car. Both Ferrin and Mageau were struck multiple times. Remarkably, Mageau survived despite being shot several times and was able to provide police with a physical description of the attacker: a white male in his mid-20s to 30s, husky build, with curly or wavy light brown hair. Though the specifics of this description would remain a subject of debate and reinterpretation for decades, as investigators tried to reconcile it with information gathered from later attacks and letters. Darlene Ferrin died at the hospital a short time after the attack. Approximately 40 minutes after the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department, calmly informing the dispatcher that he wished to report a murder, and providing the location of both this attack and, significantly, the earlier Lake Herman road killings from 6 months prior, information that had not been publicly connected to a single suspect until this call. The caller hung up before providing any further identifying information. This was the first direct communication from the man who would soon call himself Zodiac, though at the time, investigators had no way of knowing whether this call and the earlier double murder were genuinely connected or represented some kind of opportunistic false claim. It was the letters that arrived less than a month later, on August 1st, 1969, sent simultaneously to 3 separate newspapers, that transformed this string of shootings from a regional unsolved crime into a case that would command sustained national attention for the following half-century. The 3-part cipher included with these letters, when eventually solved publicly by a schoolteacher and his wife in Salinas, California, who worked on it independently of law enforcement, revealed a rambling message expressing the author's belief that killing was, for him, more thrilling and satisfying than any other human experience, and that he anticipated an afterlife in which his victims would become his servants. The cipher did not, disappointingly for investigators hoping it might yield concrete identifying information, contain his name or any specific detail that could be used to identify him. On September 27, 1969, the attacks continued and shifted in character. Bryan Hartnell, 20 years old, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were having a picnic at Lake Berryessa, a reservoir northeast of Napa, when a man approached them wearing an elaborate and disturbing costume, a black hood covering his entire head and shoulders, with a white symbol on the chest identical to the crosshair-like symbol used to sign his letters, and dark sunglasses affixed to the hood's eye holes. The man claimed to be an escaped convict who needed their car and money, and, in a detail that would become one of the case's most chilling and specific elements, requested that Hartnell tie up Shepard first before he tied Hartnell himself, using pre-cut lengths of clothesline rope that the attacker had brought with him, evidence of deliberate premeditation for this specific encounter. Once both victims were bound, the man produced a knife and stabbed each of them repeatedly, a prolonged and brutal attack witnessed and later described in harrowing detail by Hartnell, who survived despite his extensive wounds. Before leaving the scene, the attacker walked to Hartnell's car and in black marker wrote the date, the 2 prior attack locations and dates, and his now familiar crosshair symbol directly on the car door. An act of open, almost performative claiming of responsibility that stood in stark contrast to the anonymous nature of his earlier crimes. Cecilia Shepard died from her wounds 2 days later in the hospital. Bryan Hartnell survived and would go on to become one of the case's most important surviving witnesses, providing detailed testimony about the killer's appearance, mannerisms, and behavior during the attack that investigators would reference for decades afterward. The final confirmed attack occurred on October 11, 1969, in San Francisco itself, a significant departure from the previous rural and suburban settings of his earlier crimes. Paul Stine, 29 years old, was working as a taxi driver when he picked up a fare in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. The passenger directed him to a specific intersection, and once there, shot Stine once in the head at close range before taking his wallet and a portion of his shirt, torn from the bloodied garment, apparently as a trophy or as proof for future correspondence. Remarkably, this attack occurred in a residential neighborhood, and several teenagers observing from a nearby window witnessed the killer leaving the scene, providing a description to police that would become the basis for one of the most widely circulated composite sketches in American criminal history. A heavy-set white man wearing glasses, with short, dark, possibly reddish-brown hair in a crew-cut style. Despite an extensive police response, including a citywide search conducted within minutes of the shooting being reported, the killer evaded capture, in part due to what was later determined to be a miscommunication regarding the suspect's race that led responding officers to bypass a man matching the actual description while searching specifically for a different physical profile. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, taking direct credit for the Stine murder and including a section of the victim's bloodied shirt as proof, along with a chilling and explicit threat to attack a school bus, describing a plan to shoot out the tires of a bus carrying children and then, in his own words, to pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. This threat prompted a significant increase in police presence around Bay Area school bus routes for a period afterward. A direct and tangible impact of the Zodiac's letters on daily civilian life that extended well beyond the specific individuals he had physically attacked. Over the following years, spanning from late 1969 through 1974, Zodiac continued sending letters, cards, and ciphers to Bay Area newspapers with irregular frequency, several of which included additional claims of murders that were never definitively connected to any known crime, adding significantly to the uncertainty around his true total victim count. Some of these communications included additional coded messages that, unlike the August 1969 cipher, have never been definitively solved, despite decades of effort by amateur codebreakers, professional cryptographers, and in later years, crowdsourced online investigation communities that have devoted extraordinary collective effort toward cracking them. One particular cipher, sent in November 1969 and consisting of 340 individual characters, remained unsolved for over 50 years, becoming something of a holy grail for amateur cryptographers and a persistent subject of both professional and hobbyist attention throughout the following decades. In December 2020, a team of 3 independent codebreakers, working collaboratively using both traditional cryptographic techniques and modern computational tools, announced that they had successfully solved this cipher, a breakthrough that was subsequently verified and credited by the FBI. The decoded message, however, provided no identifying information about the killer's identity, containing instead a rambling statement similar in tone and content to his earlier solved cipher, expressing a similarly disturbing worldview regarding death and an afterlife populated by his victims, but offering investigators no concrete new lead toward identification. The investigation into the Zodiac killings was, from its earliest stages, complicated by significant jurisdictional fragmentation. The attacks occurred across multiple counties, including Solano, Napa, and San Francisco. each maintaining separate police departments and separate case files during an era when the kind of coordinated cross-jurisdictional task force approach that might seem obvious in retrospect was far less standard practice than it would become in later decades. Detective David Toski and Inspector William Armstrong of the San Francisco Police Department, who worked the Paul Stine murder, became among the most publicly associated investigators connected to the case, their work later serving as partial inspiration for fictionalized detective characters in film and television. But even their dedicated efforts, extended over years, failed to produce a definitive identification. Over the decades since the active period of Zodiac's letters, an enormous number of potential suspects have been investigated, publicly speculated about, or privately theorized by amateur researchers, journalists, and, in several cases, family members of individuals who came to suspect a relative might have been responsible for the crimes. Among the most prominently investigated suspects was Arthur Leigh Allen, a former teacher and convicted sex offender who was investigated extensively by law enforcement beginning in the early 1970s after being named by an acquaintance. Allen matched certain elements of victim and witness descriptions, and searches of his residence and property recovered items that investigators considered potentially significant, though DNA testing conducted years later on evidence from the case using forensic techniques unavailable at the time of the original investigation did not conclusively match Allen, and he died in 1992 without ever being formally charged. Other prominently theorized suspects have included Lawrence Kane, Richard Gaikowski, and, in a theory that received significant media attention following the 2007 publication of a book on the subject, a man named Arthur Leigh Allen was the primary subject of the film Zodiac, directed by David Fincher, which dramatized the original investigation and brought renewed mainstream attention to the case for a new generation of viewers upon its 2007 release. More recently, an independent group calling itself the Casebreakers, comprised of former law enforcement officials, journalists, and other researchers, announced in 2021 that they had identified a man named Gary Francis Post as the Zodiac Killer, based on a combination of circumstantial evidence and their own independent investigation. This claim received substantial media coverage, but has not been endorsed or confirmed by any official law enforcement agency. And significant skepticism has been raised by other researchers and journalists regarding both the strength of the evidence presented and the investigative methodology employed by this particular group. The case officially remains open and unsolved. The persistent unsolved nature of the Zodiac case has generated a uniquely extensive body of amateur and semi-professional investigation that continues, even now, more than 5 decades after the last confirmed attack. Online forums, dedicated websites, and independent researchers continue to analyze handwriting samples, re-examine physical evidence, and propose new suspects with a level of sustained, decentralized investigative effort that few other unsolved cases in American history have generated. This ongoing attention reflects both the enduring public fascination with the case's specific and unusual elements, the ciphers, the taunting letters, the distinctive costume worn during the Lake Berryessa attack, and a genuine, unresolved desire for the kind of resolution and accountability that the families of Zodiac's victims have never received. DNA testing conducted on several pieces of evidence connected to the case over the decades since the original investigation, including material recovered from letters and from physical evidence at crime scenes, has produced partial genetic profiles, though none conclusive enough, at least as of the most recent publicly available information, to identify a definitive suspect through comparison against national DNA databases or through the genetic genealogy techniques that have successfully resolved other long unsolved cold cases, including, as covered in an earlier episode of this series, the Golden State Killer case. The specific reasons why genetic genealogy has not yet produced the same breakthrough in the Zodiac case as it did for the Golden State Killer likely relate to the quality, quantity, and preservation condition of the biological evidence available from a case whose physical evidence has now been stored, transferred, and handled across more than 5 decades. A very different situation from evidence collected and preserved under increasingly rigorous modern forensic protocols. What makes the Zodiac case distinct from the previous cases covered in this series is not only its unsolved status, but the specific and calculated way its author sought to control the narrative around his own crimes, transforming himself, through his letters and ciphers, from an anonymous perpetrator of violence into an active, ongoing participant in the public discourse surrounding his own case. He did not simply commit crimes and evade capture. He communicated directly with the public, made explicit demands regarding media coverage, issued specific threats designed to generate widespread fear extending far beyond his actual physical reach, and constructed, through his choice of name and symbol, a kind of persona that has proven remarkably durable in American popular culture, referenced and reinterpreted across decades of film, television, and literature in ways that few other unsolved cases have achieved. This durability carries a complicated cost. The extensive cultural fascination with the puzzle-like elements of the Zodiac case, the unsolved ciphers, the taunting letters, the elusive identity, has at times overshadowed the basic human reality at the center of the case. 5 confirmed murders and 2 survivors who carried the physical and psychological consequences of these attacks for the remainder of their lives, along with an unknown and permanently unresolved number of additional victims the killer himself claimed, but that investigators have never been able to substantiate. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, 17 and 16 years old respectively, killed on their first date together on a quiet road outside Vallejo. Darlene Ferrin, 22, a young mother, shot while sitting in a parked car. Cecilia Shepard, 22, stabbed while picnicking at a lake with a friend, and Bryan Hartnell, who survived that same attack and lived the remainder of his life carrying both the physical scars and the singular experience of having survived a direct encounter with a killer who has never been identified. Paul Stine, 29, a taxi driver and graduate student working to support himself, shot in his own cab on an ordinary evening in San Francisco. Michael Mageau, who survived the Blue Rock Springs attack that killed Darlene Ferrin, carrying his own scars and his own singular knowledge of an encounter that has never been definitively explained or resolved. For over 5 decades, these names have existed within a case defined more by what remains unknown than by what has ever been conclusively established. Every prominent suspect investigated has ultimately been cleared, died without formal charges, or remained the subject of ongoing dispute regarding the strength of evidence connecting them to the crimes. Every attempted decoding of remaining unsolved communications, and one significant cipher remains unsolved to this day, has been pursued by generations of both professional and amateur investigators without producing the kind of definitive breakthrough that resolved, eventually, cases like the Golden State Killer that spent almost as many decades unsolved before genetic genealogy finally provided an answer. The Zodiac Killer case remains, as of this recording, officially open, actively maintained by multiple California law enforcement agencies, with the theoretical possibility that advancing forensic technology, a previously unexamined piece of physical evidence, or new information from an unexpected source, could yet, even after more than 50 years, finally provide the resolution that has eluded every previous generation of investigators who have dedicated portions of their careers, and in some cases their entire careers, to this single case. Until that resolution arrives, if it ever does, the pattern this case leaves behind is defined by absence as much as by the crimes themselves. The absence of a name behind an infamous symbol. The absence of accountability for 5 confirmed deaths and the attacks that nearly claimed 2 additional lives. The absence, for over 5 decades, of the specific kind of resolution that every other case in this series has eventually provided to the families and communities left behind by extraordinary violence. What remains in that absence are the people whose lives this case actually claimed, people whose names deserve to be remembered independently of the elaborate mythology that has grown around the symbol their killer chose for himself. 2 teenagers on a first date. A young mother. A woman on a picnic with a friend who survived to tell what happened to her. A taxi driver working to support his education. And 2 survivors who carried, for the rest of their own lives, direct and singular knowledge of an encounter with a man whose identity, even now, remains exactly what it was on the night he first opened fire on Lake Herman Road. Unknown, the pattern, in this case more than any other in this series, is not about the man behind the crosshair symbol. Precisely because we do not know who that man was. It is about David and Betty Lou, who never got to have a second date. About Darlene, whose young family lost her far too early. About Cecilia, who did not survive the attack that Bryan Hartnell did. About Paul, driving a cab on an ordinary evening that became his last. About every family who has waited over 5 decades for an answer that, as of this telling, has still never come. They are the reason this case has never been allowed to simply fade into the unresolved past. They are the reason the search continues, even now, more than half a century later.